Hi everyone, we're now in module 2 of organizational behavior, and in this module we'll be focusing on the individual level, the behaviors of people within organizations at the individual level. How do managers or how can managers best manage at the individual level, taking these individual level characteristics, traits into uh, consideration as you manage. So everything that we talk about is going to be at the individual level. In chapter 4, we're going to look at some very important individual traits, that is social perception and diversity, and how best can managers in organizations manage, understand the implications of both social perception as well as diversity. So we'll see these two issues come into the forefront. From our different definition of perception, we see that it's a cognitive process that enables us to interpret and understand our surroundings. What does that mean? Well, basically, the way that we perceive things is the way that we make sense of our world. How we understand the information that is given to us, how do we process it, and how do we then apply that to making decisions in our life? Now, this is very important. The reality is that because perception is a cognitive process, it's often a subjective process, meaning that it is highly determined by who the individual is, what their experience have been, who are they listening to, who are they being influenced, and what are they being influenced by. And because those forces tend to be different across individuals, there's some level of heterogeneity, then the cognitive processes are going to tend to be different, and the outcomes of the processes, i.e. the perceptions and the decisions that come about from those perceptions, are going to tend to be different. So it's important for managers to recognize perception to be a subjective phenomena and treat it as such and understand the implications of it, because the perception is what is going to influence my behavior, then I better be aware of what's forming my perception and some of the errors or some of the distortions that can occur in the perception process. Here we see an actual model of social perception, and this is kind of how, as individuals, we make sense of the world, and we then use this comprehension, we use this perception to inform us as we make decisions. So we start from basically paying attention to certain stimuli in the environment. We as human beings are bombarded daily with all kinds of things coming out in our senses, things we see, things we hear, even things we taste. All of those things are coming to us, and we need to interpret those things. Now, the reality is this: as human beings, we're bounded in terms of what we can pay attention to. So if you look at your life, you will realize that you only pay attention to some things. That's what we call selective attention. So this is basically how you pay attention in the first stage, what you pay attention to. The things that you then pay attention to, you have to make sense of them. And the way that you make sense of them is through the second stage, which is the encoding and simplification stage. Once you have encoded and simplified the stimuli, the information that you have processed in the environment, you then turn to stage 3, which is storing that information, putting that information in some compartment of your brain that is going to then be used later on in stage 4 in terms of the retrieval and the response. When you want to make a decision, when you want to draw an opinion, and you want to assess a situation, you are going to go back into your memory and say, okay, what do I have there that can help inform this decision? And that is going to be in the storage and retention. Remember, that's stored because of how you packaged it, how you made sense of it in stage 2. And the reason that you made sense of it is because it was salient to you in stage 1. And here we just see an explanation of all the stages. Again, getting into attention, stage 1. What is that? It's a process of becoming consciously aware of something or someone. As I said, there are many stimuli that are occurring in the environment right now. Some of that you will never be aware of because you just never have the ability, or you don't have access, if you will, to that information. But many times you find yourself becoming highly aware of things just because of what they are or how they stand out with respect to other information, other stimuli in the environment. That's basically what makes us aware of things. They stand out. And so let me use the example of when you just bought a car. Let's say you just bought a type of car, Honda Civic. And as you drive down the street, you will start seeing a ton of Honda Civics. And you'll be like, I never thought that there were that many Honda Civics around. How come everybody just bought my car when I just bought my car? The reality is not that there are more Honda Civics. I mean, that might be true. Somebody might have seen your car, liked your car, and people start buying. But most times it's because what's happening in your brain is that you have become what we call primed. That now, that Honda Civic is a salient stimuli for you. And so as you go through the environment, as you go through your life, you will be primed, you will be more aware of that information, of that stimuli, and you are therefore going to pay more attention to it. That's because it is now something that is what you said, stay salient to you. It stands out in the context. And so whatever information stands out, that's what we, are going to process. The reality is this: as human beings, we oftentimes focus more on negative stimuli than on positive stimuli. So oftentimes criticism, if I criticize a student, they're likely to remember that more, pay attention to that more than if I say something positive. Next stage in the social perception model is what we call encoding and simplification. As you get that information, as you process or you pay attention to that information in the environment, you have to find a way to make sense of it. And the way that we often make sense of it is through what we call schemas. What are schema? Schema are a mental picture or a summary of a particular event or type of stimulus. The reality is this: we cannot necessarily store or make sense of every piece of stimuli that we have access to. So what do? We kind of try to simplify it. And the way that we simplify things is kind of creating these categories that we can lump or we can attach the information that we've just seen to. So for example, if you walk around or you go to a restaurant, I should say, you go to a restaurant and they bring you a plate of spaghetti and meatballs. Instantly, you make sense of that as being Italian food. And the reason why is because in your brain, you've created this little box, this little schema that suggests that this is what Italian food looks like. So if you go to an Italian restaurant and they serve you fried catfish, you may say, well, this isn't Italian. And the reason why is because it doesn't fit into this mental picture or this box. One of the main ways that we use schemas or we create schemas is through this concept of stereotyping. Stereotyping isn't necessarily an evil thing, and that's what I want to start off with. What is stereotyping? It's essentially a set of beliefs about the characteristics or attributes of a group of people. And the way that we stereotype, or why we stereotype, is again aligned with this concept of a schema. We're trying to encode the information that we have. We're trying to simplify it so that we can, as you see in stage 3, store it more effectively. Because we cannot store all pieces of information, we try to kind of come to a small or simpler conclusion so that we can package this to make sense of our world. And that's what we do. We create stereotypes. And as I said before, they aren't necessarily always a negative thing. For example, when you think about your professors, you'll probably attach a stereotype to them as being intelligent. When you think about certain groups of people, you may have, again, certain characteristics that you say firemen, you may think, or policemen, you think that they're brave. These things help you to be or to make sense of your world in a much simpler way. Now you have to be careful because many times your schema, because it was created based upon your experiences and your own subjective interpretation, they can necessarily be accurate or they may not be accurate. For example, if you grew up in an environment where your police officers, rather than being brave, rather than being helpful, were actually cruel, then your perception, your stereotype of police officers that are in fact brave, if you use your stereotype of them being cruel, that can be inaccurate, and that's where we see the problems arising. So how do we in fact stereotype? Well, again, we first categorize people into groups according to criteria. So an athlete, for example, will have a certain body type, will have a certain look or appearance, right? Then we infer that all the people within a category possess the same traits. So we think, okay, all athletes might be fast, all athletes might be strong. And then based upon this inference, we form expectations of others and interpret their behavior according to a stereotype. So if someone says to you, hey, I'm an athlete, and you don't think that they're strong or you don't think that they're fast, they're not going to fit into your schema, your perception of what an athlete is. And if someone actually looks like an athlete, they're strong, they're fast, you're going to think, oh, okay, yeah, you're supposed to do that. And so if an athlete does not perform in that way, you're going to start questioning whether or not they are in fact an athlete, whether or not they fit into your stereotype. And that's what we do. So we categorize people into a group. We use criteria and categorize them into this group. We infer that they're going to act a certain way, and we form expectations. How does this play off in terms of our workplace? Well, it can be detrimental to some extent. For example, if you categorize women as being somewhat less hardworking than males, and then you infer that anybody who's a woman then is going to have that, is going to be relatively lazy. And so you're going to form expectations. When you see this woman at the workplace, you might think, you know what, she's not going to show up, she's not going to do a good work because she's inherently lazy. And then what you also do in the stereotyping process, or what people do, is that they try to maintain their stereotypes. It's very difficult for somebody to question or to discard their stereotypes, again, because the stereotypes were created for them to make sense of the world. And so when you have to discard a stereotype, you're asking somebody to unsettle their sensibility in terms of how they see the world. And so how do we maintain these stereotypes? Well, one, we overestimate the frequency of the stereotypic behavior exhibited by others. So let's say, going back to that example where we think that women are just inherently lazy. Well, let's say we see a situation where a woman is kind of sitting down on the job, doesn't look like they're doing something. We use this one experience, whereas this person probably works extremely hard, and we have evidence to suggest that this is just this one time deal. We're probably going to use that one experience and say, here we go. This person's lazy. They're always sitting down doing nothing. Okay, and that's what we do. We overestimate. The other thing is that we may incorrectly explain expected or unexpected behaviors. So when they fall asleep, or when we see them kind of sitting around really doing nothing, we just assume that they are being lazy. They might actually be sitting down thinking about a project, but we don't worry about it. We just want to see the evidence that we want to see to confirm what we already believe. And if we see them actually doing something active, we say, oh, you know what? They're really lazy. They're just doing this to kind of curry favor with the boss. And then we're differentiating minority individuals from oneself. We just kind of start making these comparisons between, this is me and this is them sort of issue. So that's how we continue to sustain the stereotyping, the stereotypes that we've created. One of the issues related to stereotyping, to schemas, is some of the perceptual errors that you might find as people try to make sense or simplify the world. I'm not going to talk about all, I'm just going to give you two. One perceptual error that you find commonplace in the workforce, especially when it comes to evaluations, is the halo effect. And what is the halo effect? The halo effect is when a rater forms an overall impression about an object and then uses this impression to bias ratings about the object. So this could either be good or bad. So for example, they use here is that a rating a professor high on the teaching dimensions of ability to motivate students' knowledge and communication because we like him. So in this case, you just decide, because this professor is somebody you like, that they're able to teach, they're great at motivation and great at leadership. That might not necessarily be true. You're using this one perception or this one evaluation, and you're transcending or extrapolating it across all. And that's a problem. That's why sometimes you hear that people who are good looking tend to be seen as also hardworking without any real evidence. Another one is this whole a leniency effect. And here it says it's a personal characteristic that leads an individual to constantly evaluate other people or objects in an extremely positive fashion. I mean, sometimes you have bosses that just don't want to create any conflict. They always kind of want to see the good in people, which is not necessarily bad. But when you're too lenient, when you're too absolutely concerned with hurting people's feelings, you might tend to have a problem giving true and objective evaluations. And that way you're too lenient. So obviously you have to be aware of that as you go about your duties as a manager. The third stage, coming back to our social perception process, is the storage and retention phase. And in this stage, the information that you processed and you placed into your schema now has to be stored somewhere. Just think about this like your computer. You got information, something came into your computer, you got a file, if you will. You then had to look for a folder or somewhere to put that file, to categorize that file. You did that. Now you have to store it somewhere. You store it on your hard drive, if you will. And the reason you're storing it is so that you can utilize it later on. We look at these three different areas, if you will, of storage. We have event memory, which is just information about a specific general event. You might remember the birthday party you had when you were 5 years old. Semantic memory is kind of general knowledge about the world. You know, what you think a good leader is, for example. What is a productive worker? That's semantic memory, just kind of general information about the world. And then person memories are information about a single individual or group. You may have an interaction with a manager. You may have an interaction with a coworker or a team member or a team experience, and that's a person memory. So all of these are areas of storage and retention. Again, we've simplified and coded. Now we store them so that we can utilize them in the following stage. And once we've stored them, our next step, as I said, is to retrieve and respond to it. And that's where we make our decisions. And decisions are simply the process of drawing on and interpreting and integrating the information that we have in long-term memory so that we can then make some kind of assessment, some kind of decision, some kind of judgment. That's what you do. That's why you're storing this information. That's why you're making sense of the world, so that you can then utilize that is in your retention, that is in your storage, to help you make some type of informed decision. So for example, let's say that you are now being invited to join this team exercise, to be part of a team. You go back in your memory bank and you have this storage of horrible team experiences, okay? Didn't work out very well. You had to do all the work yourself. When you're now making this decision, you'll say, you know what, I think I'll pass on it. I think I'll do my own thing, because you have stored in your memory bank bad experiences related to teamwork. And that's kind of how we make decisions. So understand this: if our entire perception process is distorted or tainted, if we have inaccurate selective attention, we have poor schemas, bad stereotypes, and then we use that information that we've then stored to make decisions, we are likely to make distorted decisions, because we're basing this essentially on faulty information. So if the file, let's put it this way, is corrupt, then applying that file to a situation is not likely to lead to great success. So we have to be careful that our process itself is not tainted, to ensure good retrieval, response, and decision. Well, how does this whole social perception matter to managers? I've given you some examples, and perhaps in each phase of the process, but just looking at one area that obviously there's implications in hiring. It says here, interviewers make hiring decisions based on their impression of how an application fits the perceived requirements of a job, and on the basis of what was also called implicit cognition. Implicit cognition represents any thoughts or beliefs that are automatically activated from memory without our conscious awareness. So again, going back to a situation where we've had some experiences and they're really embedded in our memory. And so let's say we've worked with Japanese nationals before, and we've had a very, very bad experience with the Japanese nationals that we work with. That might be something that is inherently embedded in our cognition. And so here's somebody who's coming to you and they say, listen, I'm from Japan and I want to work with you. I want to be part of your organization. And instinctively, without really even being aware of it, you start backing off and thinking, you know what, this isn't going to work. I'm not going to hire you for the position because you're Japanese and because I've had a relatively bad experience with Japanese, and therefore I am not going to want to work with you. That is problematic because, again, you're not consciously being discriminatory towards this person. You just have had this bad experience embedded in you, and so implicitly, without you even consciously doing it, that is being retrieved, and that is the thing that is influencing your decision. Another area where social perception can be influential is through a performance appraisal. It says it's important for managers here to accurately identify the behavioral characteristics and results indicative of good performance. Here is a problem if you have created a poor schema of what good and bad performance is. Let's take it from the perspective of a manager in an organization. Imagine an organization who's kind of come up the ranks, who's had to kind of earn everything, who's had to work really, really hard for everything, might see workers who are now kind of getting resources, getting trained, being babied. And so for him or her, a good performance is really having to grind, really have to be challenged, really have to use as little as possible to kind of make your way. And that's what a good performer. A bad performer, even though they might have results, is one that didn't have to go through these challenges, didn't really have to face all of these things, didn't get, didn't get the multiple obstacles placed in front of them. So if you have, again, a poor assessment or an incorrect assessment of what good and bad is, based upon what the job requirements really are, you are likely to rate or evaluate workers incorrectly. So you have to be sure that what you perceive or what you deem to be good or bad is correlated highly with what the organization objectively deems to be good and bad. And you have to be careful that you're not just using your own biases, your own judgments, your own schema that may not be necessarily correlated with what the organization requires to make these appraisals. Another area where social perception is influential is in terms of leadership. We talked in chapter 3, I believe, societal culture. The cultural traits can influence how we perceive the world and how we actually deem certain behaviors or what we deem as being important. And that can also be seen when we talk about this leadership. What are good leaders? And in certain areas, the perception of good leaders may be different based upon the cultural influences, based upon the individual influences. And sometimes people believe that good leaders should do things like assign specific tasks to members, tell others they've done well, setting specific goals for the group. That, in our mind, therefore, is what a good leader is supposed to do. That's the stereotype we've created. Therefore, if you come across someone that does not necessarily do one or some or all of these, you may not assign to them the evaluation of being a good leader. So again, you have to make sure that you understand your schema, that you understand your stereotypes and how they are influencing you in terms of your behavior, in terms of your assessment. We next turn to our attention to another implication of if you will, of the social perception model, and this is what we call causal attributions. And what are causal attributions? They are suspected or inferred causal behavior. As individuals, again, we are trying to make sense of our world. We're trying to process information, and many times the way that we do this is by trying to explain why certain people, or why people behave in certain manners. And the way that we do that is through this process of causal attribution. Well, this guy called Kelly kind of gives us these three characteristics or these three elements that we utilize to make these causal attributions. One is consensus, the other one is distinctiveness, and the third one has to do with consistency. And so Kelly is arguing that when we make causal attributions, when we infer why people have behaved in this manner, we use these three characteristics or these three traits to help us to explain that. And we measure the behavior on these three dimensions in order for us to come up with some type of causal attribution. And normally when we attribute behavior, when we explain behavior, we basically attribute it to either one or two factors. We attribute it to the internal factors, which we think are within the person, something about the person, their ability, for example, or their approach to life, or we attribute it to external behavior, something that's going out essentially outside the control of the individual, something that they are not necessarily responsible for. And so when we explain someone's behavior, we either say it's because of them or because of their environment. So returning to that model, those three dimensions, consensus, what is it? It's comparison of an individual's behavior with that of his peers. How are you behaving? How are you performing relative to those of your colleagues? That's consensus. Distinctiveness has to do with comparing a person's behavior on one task with their behavior from another task. So how are you doing in this specific role or on this specific job relative to your performance on all these other jobs? And then the third one, consistency, is judging the individual's performance on a given task or consistent or determining whether it's consistent over time. So it's a case where you are performing this like this now, and then tomorrow you're going to perform it like that, or you're going to do it differently. So in the model of attribution, those three dimensions, consensus is about comparing the person's performance to others. Distinctiveness is comparing it to other tasks that they may do, and consistency is comparing it over time. So Kelly argues that people will tend to attribute behavior to external sources when they perceive there is high consensus, meaning that they are acting in the way that others in their peer group are acting, when there is high distinctiveness, when it is not something or it's not necessarily the way that they behave or perform in all other tasks. This is something that is very unique in terms of their performance. And there is low consistency, meaning that they aren't necessarily going to perform like that on the same task tomorrow or the other day. There isn't a relative level of consistency. And that's normally when you say, okay, this is probably occurring because of some external factor. Internal attribution will normally occur when there is low consensus, when the person is not acting like their colleagues, low distinctiveness, meaning that they kind of do this or they act like this in pretty much all their other tasks, and when there is high consistency, they're normally or they act like this relatively consistent across all time periods. Along with the model of attribution is also what Kelly terms these attributional tendencies. There's a fundamental attribution bias, and then there is also the self-serving bias. I apologize, I said Kelly. This is what researchers actually have come up with, these two types of tendencies. The fundamental attribution bias is simply when we, as human beings, tend to attribute to another person's behavior to his or her personal characteristics as opposed to situational factors. What does that mean? We as human beings are likely to blame others or to attribute the failures of others to themselves rather than to the environment. So when a worker is doing something poorly, we don't as managers normally look for some type of environmental explanation. We kind of put it all on the person and say, you know what, that's their fault. So if you see a worker and they're coming too late, we think it's because they have lack of discipline, some internal factor. When the truth of the matter is, it might be because where they live, they can't get the bus on time or the bus doesn't come on time, and that's why they're getting here to work. They're trying to, but it's something in the environment. So that fundamental attribution bias lends us the propensity to want to blame people rather than the environment. The self-serving bias, listen to this one, it's a tendency to take more personal responsibility for success than for failure. So let's say you walked into an examination and it was pretty easy and you did fantastically well. You're never going to say, well, it's because this assignment wasn't that hard, that's why I did well. Most times you're going to be like, oh man, I'm just so smart, I'm just fantastic. And managers can have the same problem. They can tend to take more of the success on themselves rather than own up to failure. So that's the self-serving bias. When you're more, you attribute success more greatly to yourself. Well, of course, some of the implications to this, to manager, we mentioned it before, is that they tend to disproportionately attribute behavior to internal causes. And so that often leads to workers feeling despondent, feeling somewhat betrayed, because here am I trying to do my job, trying to be the best. I'm not necessarily doing this or doing poorly because I am some type of bad work. I don't want to. It's because of my external environment. And rather than you trying to find out what's causing that and trying to help me, then you are just simply blaming it on me without any kind of information. That obviously is coming from the fundamental attribution bias. An employee's attributions for his or own performance have dramatic effects on subsequent motivation, performance, and self-esteem. So if an employee's themselves attribute their performance to something outside of themselves, then they might not necessarily have a high level of self-esteem. If they think that the reason why they're failing is because of themselves, they are not necessarily going to be motivated to go on and do better, be committed to the task, want to do the task, because they feel like it's somewhat or it's something that they're not necessarily good at and they don't want to continue doing. So you have to be careful to consider these attributions when you are motivating, when you are setting up reward plans, as well as when you are trying to get workers to believe in themselves.